Hello and welcome to the XStore point of service Spring and dependency injection lesson. In this lesson, we're going to talk about how XStore uses Spring to satisfy dependency injection and working with scoped data and value keys. So Spring DI, or dependency injection, was integrated into XStore several years ago. If you've used XStore for a long time, you may have remembered past versions using the command framework, the IXST command interface, using properties files to declare instances of helper classes. And a while back, we introduced Spring to make it a lot easier to manage those sorts of dependencies and to share data between classes. So the dependency injection mechanism of the Spring framework was chosen basically to take advantage of Spring's XML-driven bean configurations, which are used to define all of XStore's managed classes. These Spring XML files are loaded using the XStore config path, so it's similar to the way that all other config files in XStore are managed. You have different config path entries based on your register's profile and store type, and you can declare different bean instances for your helper classes, for any of your singletons, validation rules, and similar classes. So the way that Spring files are configured in XStore is that they're treated as a directory-based config, so any Spring file has to be in a Spring subfolder in an XStore config path location. The one thing to keep in mind about Spring files compared to the other XStore configuration files that get loaded like opchain config, menu config, action config, is that Spring files must each have a unique name across the entire application. So if you think about a config file like opchain config.xml, there's an opchain config.xml file in the DTV res config directory. You could have one in your cust config version 1 directory, and you could have a file of the same name in many other config path directories. You can't do that with the Spring files. If you do that with Spring, the file of the same name that you're replacing is going to take complete precedence over the base file or whatever file you're overriding. It won't be additive and overlay the base file the same way that other XStore config files will. So you need to be really careful about that. If you have Spring files in your overlay, they do work like regular XStore config files that are directory based, but the file names must be unique across the entire application, and that includes both the base and the customer files. So as part of integrating the Spring framework to XStore, we added 3 new custom scopes in addition to the 2 generally usable scopes, which are singleton and prototype, packaged with Spring for desktop applications. It's notable that in XStore Mobile, we also use the Spring session scope, and typically you'll see that when you have some sort of a stateful bean or helper or some kind of class that essentially needs to have its own instance for every session. So in XStore Mobile, you'll see instances where beans are declared in the base Spring file with perhaps as a singleton instance or maybe an application mode instance. And then in the mobile config path, those files are overridden as session-based beans for mobile. That ensures, again, that every mobile session gets its own instance of that bean so that multiple client sessions running against the same XStore Mobile server won't come into conflict. So the 3 scopes that we added to XStore as part of our integration to the Spring framework are application mode. So application mode is used for beans that need to have a separate instance of the bean tied to the register and back office modes. So anyone that's worked in XStore Desktop should be familiar with the feature in back office that allows you to navigate into the register using the F12 key, perform a transaction, and then go back into the back office mode, picking up exactly where you left off. So if you were in the middle of processing an inventory document, for example, and a customer came to the register, you could hit F12, go into register mode, complete your transaction, send the customer away, go back into back office, and be right where you left off in the inventory document. But to pull that off, XStore has always had to have separate instances of some core foundational classes like the opchain processor, because the opchain processor managed by the back office needs to retain its state while the user goes on into the register. So in XStore, when you're looking at the Spring configurations, when you see beans that are tagged with the application mode scope, that's pretty much what they're there for, so that you can have one instance used in the back office and one instance used in the register. This only really applies to XStore Desktop because that's the only form factor of XStore where this functionality exists. Again, when you're talking about XStore Mobile, whether it's tablet or handheld, you're going to see the session scope used, which allows there to be a separate instance of the bean for every mobile client. The training mode scope is used for service provider beans that require separate runtime implementations to be used in training mode. So this is particularly useful when we're talking about service implementations for something like customer engagement, where we effectively don't want to be talking or persisting data to a live customer engagement system when the user is in training mode, because customer engagement doesn't necessarily know whether the data that we would be giving it would be real data or training data. So the training mode scope is a convenient mechanism that allows you to swap implementations for a service provider implementation when you're in training mode so that you're not actually persisting to an external system from training mode. And the third custom scope that we added in our Spring integration is the transaction scope. So this is used for beans that require a single instance to be managed specifically for the duration of a transaction. This scope isn't used very often. The actual IPOS transaction object is managed through this scope, but generally the types of data that qualify for transaction scope type of management are usually part of the transaction object graph anyway. So you typically don't need to use this scope explicitly, but it's still a very useful tool to have at your disposal in cases where you have data that needs to be persisted in memory just as long as your current transaction is in process. So if I go over and look at my Eclipse environment and I open the spring.xml file, the spring.xml file is the primary file where we define many of our Spring configurations, particularly helper classes. So in the past, in older XStore versions, you may have seen singleton instances of classes declared in system property files, where you could swap the instances by declaring the property value to be a different class implementation. And then there would have to be some secret magic going on inside the class implementation to know that its instance needed to be loaded from the system property value. Spring kind of lets us manage all of that automatically. So we use Spring for most of these now. So if I look through this file, there are all kinds of helpers in XStore. So I look at the employee helper, the customer account factory, the customer account helper. You'll see all these class implementations declared in here. And you can override these in your own custom Spring file if you need to extend it for a customer. You'll also notice that there's no scope attribute on any of these declarations that are in this section, and that just means that these are going to be treated as singleton classes. As long as these classes don't have any state that they need to manage, singleton is fine. Even in XStore Mobile, you can use the same instance of a bean for all of your client sessions as long as there's no state that needs to be maintained and no synchronicity that needs to be managed. But if I scroll through other sections of the file and I go and I look at default scope and transaction scope, bean declarations, you'll see that those have the application mode scope. So this is what we were talking about a little earlier when we said that some of these objects need to have their own instances in desktop XStore for register and for back office. So default scope is the scope that essentially manages all of the data entered by the user and essentially anything that the current chain is passing between its operations. So it's very important that we maintain a separate instance of default scope and of a transaction scope in register and back office modes. If I flip over to the mobile beans file, which is a Spring overrides file, it declares some custom beans for XStore Mobile, but mostly is overriding base beans and changing some of their properties specifically for XStore Mobile. You'll see that the default scope and the transaction scope beans are actually scoped with the session scope in this file, and that again is so that every XStore Mobile client gets their own instance of the bean so that the clients are not essentially stepping on one another's toes and sharing memory space where they shouldn't be. Moving on to scoping and value keys, with the integration of the Spring framework, an all-new scoped data management mechanism has been introduced. Those of you that used XStore years ago know that there used to be this IXST command interface that declared essentially a map of data that was passed between operations in a running chain. This wasn't really the most elegant way to pass this data around. You had to declare the IXST command object in your method signatures. It was not necessarily easy to get at this data outside of operation classes, so if you were in a visibility rule or a validation rule, it wasn't always easy to access the data that you were passing around. The scoping changes that we made with the Spring integration really improved that quite a bit. So the intent of the scoping and value keys paradigm is that common values, like an item ID entered by a user, regardless of where they are used within the application, can be accessible and referenced in a consistent way across the application. At the core of this mechanism is a two-part system that involves a scoped value container and a key for storing and accessing the contained values. The design of the scoped value container is technically inspired by the concept of a type-safe heterogeneous container. So what does that mean? If we go back over to Eclipse and I open my XST-POS project and I open my source folder and I decide I want to create a new operation. So I'm going to say new class. We'll call it test spring op. And we want it to just extend the core operation class, which is DTV POS framework op. So we'll go ahead and finish that. We now have a new class. And again, if you worked in XStore in older versions, you'll know that handle op exec, the method signature, used to take an IXST command argument in addition to the event argument. No longer. Now it's only an IXST event. So let's say that we had some string data that we got from the user. We'll just call it test. But typically you would get this data off of the event object, maybe after you had prompted the user with a focus bar to enter some piece of information. If I wanted to store this data so other operations or visibility rules or validation rules or other classes could access it, I could call set scoped value. And I need to give set scoped value a value key, and I also need to give it the value. So the value keys are defined in a class called valuekeys.java. If you need to write your own value keys for your customer implementation, you can make your own class in the customer extension layer to hold those. You can also reference the base values. So really, however you want to do it, this is just an organizational structure. There's no real specific reason that this needs to be named value keys or that these things need to live in here. It's just convenient to have them all together in one place. Let's say that that string that the user entered, rather than calling it test, let's pretend it was an item ID. So I'm going to change test to item ID. And let's say they entered the item ID 1002, which is a common base item that we use for testing. So if I look through this value keys class, there's a value key called entered item ID. It's of type string. So I'm going to use that value key and set my item ID value into scope. And so by doing this, I've now put this item ID into this specific key in the map in what we call the default scope, which is managed by Spring. The nice thing about this is Spring, based on the way we've integrated it into XStore, is going to know exactly when this map needs to be purged or when this value key needs to be removed. If we roll back to a previous rollback level in the chain, the value will be cleared out. If we move on to higher rollback levels, the key should be retained. So there's a lot of built-in sort of intelligence to make sure that XStore and Spring work together to manage your data appropriately. Now what I can do in this class or any other class, so if I have another variable called item ID in scope, then I can call get scoped value, and I can just use that same value key again. We've got it there, some windows popping up. And while it's a little silly that I did this right here in the same operation, you kind of get the idea. I can set this in scope. It's going to remain in scope while I run other operations, do other things. If I was in a visibility rule, a validation rule, another operation, or any other class where I wanted to access this data, as long as I have access to the default scope, which is in turn injected using the Spring framework, I can get at this item ID that was put into scope and I would get this value back. If I look at the base operation class real briefly, you can see that the base operation class uses Spring to inject the default scope. It's private, but we provide convenience methods. If I flip through here, so we provide a clear scoped value, we provide a get scoped value, and a set scoped value. So those are protected methods. They're usable in any operation, but really any class where you have the ability to inject the default scope, you can call set value, get value on the scope, and it's an extremely convenient way to pass data around between operations. All right, so moving on, we've been looking at this a little, but we'll go through a few more points on the default and transaction scopes. So the default scope is the primary scope management interface for any values that need to be held temporarily for use within one or more operations and their corresponding validation rules, which is pretty much what we just reviewed. As a general rule, only operations should ever put values into default scope. Default scope is generally holding data that was entered by the user or data that an operation, through some sort of data processing, came up with some value that needed to be retained for the rest of the scope. It could be the return value from a helper method or something along those lines. But really, it's only the operations that should be putting data into scope. There's no real reason for a validation rule or a visibility rule to be putting data into scope. Those classes should really be just looking at the data that is in scope and making a determination as to whether a menu button should be accessed or whether the data is valid and things like that. So the reason is the values in default scope are most often values that were input by a user, as just stated, selected by a user, or derived from an input by a user. Again, the transaction scope, that's a special value key container for value key instances that should be available for the entire duration of an XStore POS transaction. As a general rule, you always want to use default scope as the preferred location for a new value key unless the stored data needs to be referenced for the entire duration of the transaction and is not part of the actual transaction object graph. If the data is part of the actual transaction object graph, for example, a transaction property or a line item or a tender or a tax, those pieces of data are already accessible in scope because they're already hanging off of that transaction object graph, which is managed in transaction scope. So you would never need to put those in transaction scope separately. So that concludes our lesson on Spring dependency injection in the XStore point of service. Thank you.